Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Zaltzer, for that introduction, and thank you to Yad Vashem and to the organizers for inviting me to participate in this really wonderful and interesting conference. My topic for this presentation will actually follow very well, I think, from Eliana's wonderful talk, as I'll be picking up a lot of the same themes about encounters and interactions on the Soviet home front, as she already discussed. So let me begin. At the age of 21, Jack Pomerance fled from his hometown of Radzyń in eastern Poland to escape the advancing Nazi armies. Over the next 5 years, Pomerance's travels took him across the wide expanse of Soviet territory, from western Belarus to Tashkent and Alma-Ata, to a labor camp in Siberia, and finally to Moscow, and then back to Poland, where he returned as a soldier with the Red Army. And although Pomerance's journey may seem somewhat extraordinary, it's indeed typical of the experiences of many Polish Jewish refugees who, I think, as Eliana pointed out, have had very nomadic migrations throughout this period. In a memoir written in the 1990s, Pomerance writes of his encounter with a Soviet Jewish Red Army officer once he had escaped from the Siberian camp where he had been detained. The officer helped him gain passage to Alma-Ata and shared his food supplies with Pomerance, and they had a relatively short interaction. But during this time, Pomerance and the officer conversed in Yiddish, and while his new friend was reticent to reveal much about himself, he was eager to hear about Pomerance's past life and his experiences. And this is what Pomerance writes in his memoir. He wanted to know about me, where I was from, what I had done, my stories of running away. He asked some questions and I talked, grateful at last to have a sympathetic ear, someone who was concerned. We spent hours in the private luxury of the compartment, which had been assigned to the Soviet Jewish Red Army officer. It felt like freedom. The officer even invited Pomerance to his home and offered him the option of staying with his family while Pomerance awaited the chance to return home to Poland, an offer that he refused. In some ways, this incident provides a glimpse into the nature of relations between Polish Jewish refugees, so those who came from the territories, the annexed or the non-annexed territories of Poland, many of them who had been deported by the Soviet authorities between 1939 and 1941. And the Soviet Jewish evacuees who had Soviet citizenship prior to 1931 and lived in the territories of the Soviet Union that were part of the Soviet Union before 1939. And in Central Asia, Siberia, and the Urals, these evacuees and refugees, the terms are problematic, but in the interest of time, I will distinguish those two groups by using those terms: evacuees for the Soviets, refugees for the Poles. They found themselves in areas that were foreign and familiar to both groups, and there they began to reconstitute some semblance of community. At the same time, as Eliana pointed out, it is clear that significant differences in status, background, and political allegiance meant that these friendships were more complex and fraught than one might imagine. Wartime displacement provided opportunities for Jews of different backgrounds to encounter and learn about and from one another, but they also reveal what being Jewish meant to for these distinct populations, and it certainly wasn't the same. In many cases, these differences were indeed stark, despite the fact that just 25 years earlier, most had lived under relatively similar conditions within the Pale of Settlement of the Russian Empire. In this talk, I will discuss specifically the interactions between these two groups that revolved around cultural, religious, and ethnic identity. There's an important side to this story that is about economic ties, some of which have already come up. I won't be able to talk about that today, but all of this will hopefully this will appear in a chapter of an edited collection through Wayne State University Press that Eliana and I are both participating in. Both Soviet and Polish Jewish accounts attest that the arrival of the more observant Polish refugees on the Soviet home front reinvigorated Jewish religious practice, while Polish Jews largely initiated these efforts to celebrate Jewish holidays, carry out traditional rites. Evacuated Soviet Jews often took part. And I will be referring largely to evidence from memoirs and interviews and testimonies that were, most of which were recorded in the past 20, 25 years. But I do have actually some sources, one of which I will discuss now, from a series of interviews done by the AJC, American Jewish Committee, in 1947, 48, sorry. So immediately after the war. So one of these individuals interviewed by the AJC in the late 1940s traveled to Dagestan with his family. Yes, so this is a very, very geography, but I've just put up some of the locations of the specific cases that I will be discussing. These are the sites, so... this particular case, Dagestan, in the Caucasus. He traveled with his family there after the amnesty and recalled attending services at a synagogue which had been set up by the local community of mountain Jews. He served as a ritual slaughterer for the community during his stay there, but noted that he observed the Jews from Kiev and Kharkov also attending services at the synagogue. Once Nazi forces approached the region, Treitman and his family moved further east to Central Asia, where they had similar experiences. He recalled Polish Jews organizing prayer groups, collecting funds for the ritual bath, and establishing a yeshiva, while noting that only Polish Jews attended the yeshiva. What he calls Russian Jews, and I'll call them Soviet Jews, contributed funds for the construction of the ritual bath, even though they seem to not have taken part in the rituals. And maybe speculated that the Soviet Jews felt that their support of these initiatives served as a way to fulfill their duties or obligations as Jews to their fellow co-religionists, but they felt very worried about actually participating in these ceremonies and in these traditions because of what it might mean for their own professional well-being. Some did express a degree of interest in these events, particularly the elderly evacuees, who were likely to have practiced Judaism earlier in their lives and were less concerned about the potential ramifications for their careers if their behavior was noted by the Soviet authorities. According to one interview, Orthodox Jews from Russia and Bessarabia collaborated in opening 2 synagogues in Oshtube in Kazakhstan. And the community also had a shohed and a Jew from Kiev who performed ritual circumcisions. In fact, some interviews suggest that Soviet Jews were inspired and impressed by refugees' willingness to practice their faith and their traditions openly. After befriending a Polish Jewish young man in Kazakhstan, one Soviet Jew was invited to attend a Polish Jewish wedding with him, where she observed the traditional Jewish wedding ritual under a huppah, and the scene made a big impression on her. In the memoir of Itzhak Erlichson, who I think was already mentioned, he notes that Soviet Jews in Jambul and southern Kazakhstan, and Jambul, Alma-Ata, Tashkent, all of these areas were main sites for evacuees and refugees. So in Jambul, Erlichson notes that Soviet Jews were pleased to witness a Jewish wedding celebration. For the occasion, Erlichson friend, another Pole, made a speech in Hebrew. And according to Erlichson, I believe, this is from his memoir, the Russian Jews were really, this is in his words, the Russian Jews were really beaming when they heard a speech in the holy language. They swallowed every word as if it were pure honey. Moreover, most of them had not attended a Jewish wedding in a long time. They were moved and congratulated us warmly. Like weddings, burials were also key moments for the community to come together. In recalling his time in Bashkiria, Bashkortostan, which... right there, Herman Carmel, who was a Jew from Czechoslovakia who had escaped to Latvia in 1939 and fled east from there, described the creation of a Jewish community thanks to the efforts of one Mendel Menehes, who was evacuated from Belarus with his daughter's family and became a leader and had earlier been a leader of the religious community in Mosul prior to the revolution. Carmel, who's foreign, and Menahem became quite close, and Carmel would then later dubbed him as the one-man, in his terms, the one-man Jewish charitable institution in Tamak. Menahem consulted on religious matters, collected money for the more needy members of the community, performed burial rites, and even organized the Seder. Polish Jews and Soviet Jews who lost their lives during the war years in Tamak were buried then at the site of the old Jewish cemetery, which had been established by the small pre-revolutionary Jewish community of Cantonists, who were Jews who were conscripted into the Tsarist army at a young age in the 19th century. However, these interactions were not free of tension. According to a Yiddish memoir that has been cited by Yosef Litvak, when two Polish Jews approached a Soviet Jewish cooperative director to ask for a donation for the Jewish Burial Society, he initially threw them out of his office, but then called one of his employees and gave him money to give to them, so as to be able to contribute the money, but to make sure that outwardly it looked like he didn't do that because he thought that it would reflect poorly on him as a good Soviet Jew. So these interactions reveal both a sense of familiarity, born out of a shared identity, as well as a certain bemusement and apprehension that comes from the distinct experiences of these groups. For some of the young Soviet Jewish children who were really well assimilated into Soviet culture found the Polish Jews quite odd and saw them as kind of a novelty. They looked different, they talked very differently, they dressed very differently. So some of their accounts kind of reflect the sense of interest and curiosity in these people who definitely were not familiar, but there was a sense of there's some kind of bond there, but it's not really clear what that bond is. And in some cases, these interactions became quite contentious. In one particularly interesting account from Osh, Kyrgyzstan, Max Koifman, who had been evacuated from the town of Shostka in central Ukraine, so Soviet Jewish, with his family, recalled an encounter with a Polish Jewish family that lives next door. One day, while Max and his sister were caring for their baby brother while their mother worked, one of the neighbors poked his head into the room and explained that a real, or nastayashi, Jew should be circumcised. And Koifman's description of the guest was that he was an older man who had something or other to do with medicine. So he suggested he was a mochel, or had been a mochel, a ritual slaughter, someone who performs circumcisions. He further explained that it was particularly important. This neighbor explained that it was particularly important for Koifman's brother, who was blonde, unlike his siblings, to be circumcised so that he would look like a Jew. The neighbor proceeded to perform the circumcision, recruiting Koifman and his sister to help out. Not surprisingly, Koifman's mother was horrified when she arrived home to discover what had transpired and was particularly irate with the neighbor. She obviously had a very different understanding of what it meant to be a nastayashi, a real Jew, and yelled at him for what he had done, while he tried to explain that he was only trying to do what was best for her son so that he would now be protected by the Almighty. Naturally, in this case, the neighbor's assumption of a shared faith and common practice between the two families proved to be somewhat problematic and erroneous. While religious practice and observance of traditions could understandably prove to be a point of contention, there was a shared, also linguistic and cultural background, and this was in part a shared interest in Yiddish literature and Yiddish press. During the war, the Soviet Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee put out a Yiddish newspaper, Evacuees, Unity in Yiddish, which served as a propaganda tool aimed at both the domestic and international Jewish audience. And the arrival and consumption or reading of Einigkeit among the refugees and evacuees proved to be occasions where these two groups came together and kind of and bonded, because there was such a hunger for anything that was news from the front and anything that was, in Yiddish, essentially. Despite the fact that many assimilated Soviet Jews continued to shy away from any outward expression of their Jewish identity, the popularity of Einigkeit reflected a newfound excitement about the possibility of the revival of Jewish life in the Soviet Union, especially in the wake of the assault on Jewish schools and cultural institutions in the later 1930s. Apologies. And this is a quote from Bashkiria, Carmel's case. So again, here it is, near Ufa in the Volga region. And he writes, getting the Einigkeit used to be an event. Sasha, who was an acquaintance of his, a lawyer from Moscow, would lend the newspaper out to many evacuees, and it became worn and stained and got to be illegible. Right. So this was again an instance where these two groups came together, and in some cases it seems that the Poles borrowed Yiddish literature that the Soviet Jews brought with them. In some cases. So the secular Yiddish literature and culture served as an important conduit that brought these different elements of the Jewish community together at sites of resettlement, and in part it was more safe because it was devoid of political and religious connotations that would have been worrisome for Soviet Jews. Yet, as always, there were limits to how far Soviet Jews were willing to go. In Tashkent, of course, being a very important hub of evacuees and refugees, as Eliana had mentioned, Tashkent, city of bread, not so much a city of bread as many of them discovered, but by that point it was a bit too late. One Polish Jewish refugee inquired of a Soviet Jew who was an NKVD official, a secret police official, why Yiddish fiction books were available but Jewish history books were not. And he was told that, in fact, there was no need for this, since Jewish history is the history of the Soviet Communist Party. So he just kind of shuts him down very quickly. And this, obviously, response echoes the official Soviet line about, nationality. So the Soviet Jews were careful to ensure that expressions of Jewish culture, especially those who were highly placed within the Soviet apparatus, that any expressions of Jewish culture could not be construed in any kind of anti-Soviet fashion. This is in part why Einigkeit proves to be important, because Einigkeit is an official Soviet newspaper, and it was fine to read, Einigkeit. There was no anti-patriotic associations with that. And in fact, on numerous occasions, the political commitments and distinct views on Jewishness and on the Soviet system itself drove a wedge between the refugees and the evacuees, thwarting trust and intimacy between the two groups. After all, many Polish Jews had had first-hand experience of the coercive practices of the Soviet regime, those who had been deported to the labor camps between 1939 and 1941. And had very few ideals about the wonderfulness of the Soviet system. And they had no intention of remaining in the Soviet Union after the conclusion of the war. They intended to go back home to rejoin their families in Poland. But Soviet Jews, on the other hand, were employed by Soviet enterprises and organizations and expected to return to their homes after the war within the borders of the Soviet Union. And this is a real tension that comes up in a lot of accounts, that there's friendship, but it can only go so far. So Carmel, the author of this quote, noted that he befriended many Soviet Jews, but in his words, there was an invisible line of frankness beyond which they were unwilling to go. Moreover, a clear difference in social status between the Polish and Soviet Jews also served to create an often unstated barrier between the two. Having settled in Kambarka in the Udmurt SSR, up here, Rita Bladberg, who was a Polish Jewish refugee, her family relied on their friendships with both Polish and Soviet Jews. And she talks about kind of a larger community, a family circle that involved these various couples. There were the Ginsburgs from Vilnius, who they were close to, as well as the Fishkin couple, physicians from Minsk. And in one case, she even refers to these couples as mamasha and papasha to indicate the familiarity, right? So mother and father, and the closeness between these families. But yet, in one case, despite these friendships, Blattberg, even as a child, could perceive the difference in social rank between the Soviet Jews and her family. And this is how she writes. In one memorable evening, I demanded to be told why our Soviet friends, like the Fishkins and the Ginsburgs, were called evacuees, whereas we, the Poles, were called bieżency, a word which in Russian means literally those who have run away. If we have run away, I said indignantly, then so have they. We all ran away from the fascist invaders. More than an issue of semantics, what bothered me was an uneasy feeling that somehow we were at the very bottom of the totem pole, less worthy and less secure than the others. Finishing up, thank you. So she kind of puts her finger on these distinctions, and in fact, her sense that the position of Polish Jews was less secure and that they were certainly more untethered than the Soviet Jews is in fact quite accurate in most cases. The Fishkins and the Ginsburgs, their Soviet friends, belonged within the orbit of Soviet society, while Blumsteim's family, former deportees and Polish citizens who struggled to master the Russian language, could not claim membership within it. And in fact, one indication of this is that Polish Jewish memoirs and accounts are much more likely to talk about their interactions with the Soviet Jews, in part because the Soviet Jews were instrumental in their survival, whereas the Soviet Jewish memoirs and interviews rarely mentioned their encounters with the Polish Jews, more often than not as an eccentricity than anything else. So in my presentation today, this is given just a preliminary indication of the types of interactions and relations among Jewish refugees and evacuees on Soviet home front. There's much left to say, but it is evident that both Soviet Jews and Polish Jews were forced to confront a distinct population who understood their Jewishness in rather different terms. What is unclear is the extent to which these encounters left a lasting impact. It is difficult to track down evidence of this, and that which exists is anecdotal. However, Soviet Jewish narratives, the oral histories and memoirs, often place their experiences in evacuation, especially incidents of anti-Semitism, which I did not discuss here, but discuss elsewhere in my work, and encounters with the Polish Jews, as laying the groundwork for their later trajectories, and as laying the groundwork for their later understandings of what it meant to be Jewish, and which also often include the personal experience of Soviet post-war anti-Semitism and later emigration. And that's often the way they frame this in their memoirs, that one of the key moments when they began to see themselves in a different way was the war and the evacuation specifically, not the Holocaust, because that was not part of their direct experience. So these the question then arises that whether one might claim that wartime displacement contributed to Soviet Jews becoming more aware of their distinctiveness, or whether this is simply a reflection of how Soviet Jews constructed their life stories decades later. For the Polish Jews, it's not clear whether they kind of saw the Soviet Jews in their rejection of many elements of Judaism as problematic. They didn't strive to adopt that kind of Jewish identity, but it was an important encounter for them.